I think really SpaceX should go public on the Martian stock market once they arrive there. That I think would work out well for them. Maybe you could report earnings every 6 months on the Martian stock market. We'll have to see.
Welcome to the GigaCast. My name is Gav, here with Omar, Sawyer, and Farzad. And today we're going to space. Talking a little bit about SpaceX to kick things off. There's so many questions that people have around a potential IPO, the company, the business. Sawyer, why don't you kick us off with your insights?
Yeah, sure. So I've probably gotten thousands of DMs over the years, and certainly every week asking, how do I buy SpaceX shares? When is SpaceX going to IPO? Because retail shareholders, they don't really have access. So I figured we could maybe go through some maybe scenarios for and against SpaceX IPOing. And some of the reasons I sort of came up with was, one, obviously a lot of companies IPO to raise capital, but SpaceX doesn't really need that. Liquidity for shareholders, founders, early investors, they can sell shares, realizing returns on their investment. But also you can sometimes get better loan and financing opportunities. Like public companies often have access to better borrowing terms due to, increased transparency and valuation. But honestly, I don't really see that as an issue for Elon because he has really good connections in cloud, especially with Morgan Stanley. And like I said, access for retail shareholders, by and large, retail shareholders have really no way of buying SpaceX stock unless they go through an SPV or some fund. And both of those typically have really high fees. And, we know Elon appreciates retail shareholders. They're often the most feisty and they fight for him. And like I said, I've gotten a lot of DMs over the years from retail shareholders wanting to buy SpaceX stock. And the other thing for an IPO would be, there's limits of a private valuation. SpaceX is currently valued at $350 billion, I think. And their most recent secondary round was oversubscribed, even at that valuation. And I'm not really sure how high a valuation will go before investors start wanting to, take profits. At some point, you want to make money on your investment. But at that point,
are they the most valuable private company in the world?
So ByteDance was equally, I think, at 300 billion. But
you're telling me it's not Chick-fil-A?
It's what?
You're telling me it's
Chick-fil-A?
Not Chick-fil-A?
Definitely not Chick-fil-A. Yeah, so I think SpaceX is the most highly valued private company in the world now. It jumped from 210 billion in the fall of last year to 350 in December. So it's probably even going to go higher in the next few months.
Confirmed.
Yeah.
Wow. So double OpenAI.
But SpaceX hasn't raised money in years. I don't know if you guys know this, but all their rounds have been secondary rounds or opportunities for existing shareholders to sell their shares. And SpaceX has been buying back their own shares for a while now, which tells me that, they're in a good financial position, but also that Starlink is generating enough cash to fund their growth.
Do we know, I know they're private, obviously it's going to be tough to understand this, but is there what percentage of their cash flow is from Starlink versus the Falcon program?
They haven't really broken that out. I know Gwen did share that Starlink itself is now profitable as of last year, but yeah, that's the thing with a private company. We don't really get this insight. And even investors that go into special purpose vehicles or SPVs that invest through that vehicle, they don't even really get transparency into the financials.
I wonder what Grok would say if you asked it to, there we go, break down the percentages. Yeah, not public. Okay.
Honestly, I think those are just from studies or analysis or research reports from third parties that don't really have any insight themselves. But
roughly 55 to 60% is the estimate there.
Okay.
But then they're go ahead.
Yeah. No, please.
Well, I want to get to the points against, but let's go to your point first.
No, I don't even remember what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Okay. A few points against I can think of. There is some level of loss of control. Once you're public, a company must answer to shareholders, and CEOs may lose some decision-making power, although that doesn't really tend to be an issue with Elon companies. You got regulatory and compliance costs, although that's not really a huge deal. Market pressure, short-term focus. Investors typically want quarterly earnings growth, and that can push a company to prioritize short-term gains over long-term strategy. And we all know that Elon's companies are very long-term focused, especially SpaceX. And the last point would be, market volatility, I guess. Tesla stock is notoriously volatile. And so is really emotionally driven stock and short-term driven. And it creates a lot of chaos, which is something that I don't think Elon likes. And I will say Tesla's shareholder case out of Delaware, Elon's compensation case, I think has potentially influenced Elon's thinking into IPOing SpaceX long-term, depending on how the outcome goes down.
That's a great point.
But because this is a real risk that was presented to Tesla long-term shareholders that we didn't really see coming, right? And there was a potential to Elon lose a lot of money, a lot of voting access. And there was some speculation of like whether he would potentially leave Tesla if he didn't, win that vote. So for Elon, it's like, well, if I don't take SpaceX public, I'm not going to have these type of shareholder lawsuits come at me from, these predatory law firms wanting to make money off of small shareholders. So yeah, those are sort of some of the thoughts.
Well, I think what's interesting, the Delaware point is a brilliant one. I do think there's still they're going through the appeal process. I know they're doing an amicus brief, with the original pay. I saw that McCormick in Delaware, the judge that ruled against the pay, when she rescinded it, she said that the move to Texas was legal because shareholders voted on moving to Texas. I'm like, okay, shareholders voted for the compensation twice, but okay, we'll put that aside. We'll let that go through the process. So I think the appeal process might remove that as a potential risk. But I think what's interesting from like SpaceX going public versus Tesla, I think Tesla has had a very unique set of circumstances because the auto market is so entrenched. I think a lot of the investor base didn't understand, at least. I think that has changed quite a bit since IPO for Tesla. They didn't truly understand the disruption that was happening in the automotive sector. They didn't really view autonomous vehicles long-term as a viable business model. They didn't view electric vehicles as a viable business model because it was always thought as the more expensive drivetrain versus the gas one, where it has, decades of a supply chain built up and manufacturing capacity and all that stuff. That has changed. In the case of SpaceX, I mean, who is SpaceX's competitor? Like they are basically, they have created a market for themselves, and it's all because of reusable rocket technology. Starlink is possible because of reusable rocket technology. They have an enormous moat when it comes to the space business. Now there are other players like your Fireflies and your what's the other guy? I know Matt Smith really likes this one. I forget. Rocket Labs is another one. There are other startup space companies that have a lot of promise. Innovation
Blue
design
Origin too, Jeff Bezos.
Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic once upon a time, right? So I think, and then if you view it within the context of, let's say the current administration and any future ones start creating an environment for space manufacturing to come to the United States and actually try to spool up entrepreneurship and business creation, the space frontier is one that is ripe for all kinds of, just for it to actually be birthed, not even disruption. It doesn't really exist, asteroid
Yeah, we should
mining.
also specify that it wouldn't be like SpaceX itself that would probably IPO. It would be Starlink. It'd be the spinoff. But most of the value, I think, in SpaceX is Starlink.
That's kind of what I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on. It is the two different pieces there within the IPO.
I don't know. I feel like the rocket business, I think we might be like, for sure, going to Mars is going to be a gigantic money suck for sure. But I think and this is very loose and not at all well thought out, but I find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be some sort of viable business case for the rocket side of the equation on Earth or even nearby, like space tourism. Again, could we mine on Mars or on the moon rather and bring some, are there some materials there that we can use on Earth, so on and so forth. It's definitely interesting. I think in the short to medium term, Starlink is by far the most valuable. Like when I say short to medium term, next 5 to 10 years. But I do think from a long-term perspective, space feels giant. I mean, that's in so many different ways.
I think there's a lot more to go down on the space side. Before we go into that, Omar, what do you think on the IPO side of things?
Well, in terms of SpaceX IPOing, I see all negatives and no positives. Because as Sawyer pointed out, they don't need to raise capital. They're making billions of dollars from Starlink and their launch services. Yeah. Meanwhile, when you go public, you've now got quarterly earnings reporting. You've got the stock moving up and down anytime anything happens. You know, there's a launch and the rocket explodes or something. Now the stock is tanking. Businesses that are well suited to go public are typically businesses that have predictable earnings and growth. And SpaceX, you know, they're trying to get to Mars. That's the focus. They're trying to build a business here. And I don't think it's really in their interest to have people looking at quarterly earnings. I mean, it's so arbitrary. What did you earn from January to March? Well, what if there's some satellite or some launch that isn't going to be ready until the summer? I think Tesla being public has been a pain in the ass in many ways. You've also, of course, got shareholder lawsuits. When you have a few large shareholders, you're unlikely to see frivolous shareholder lawsuits. But when anyone can be a shareholder, anyone with 9 shares, for example, then you do waste a lot more time in litigation, expensive litigation, which frankly, they don't need to do because they have all the capital they need to sustain themselves. So you're